Hey everyone, Jared here from Chronosapien again, and we're on to the last step of our 3D modeling process. So we tested our object and everything was looking good. So what we did afterwards was we cleaned it up, smoothed it out a little bit, add a little bit of extra details. As you can see, I went ahead and put some textures on it, or materials rather, and I went ahead and put it all onto one UV map rather than having the separate materials. So, everything's nice and laid out here. It's plain and simple to see what's what. That's a big important thing when you're UVing, is you want it to be obvious and you want things that are similar, close to each other, not random all over the place. So if you need to make any changes after the fact, it's easy to do. I am using Painter, or Substance Painter. It's a really great program. So as you can see, I already have a few layers here, so let's go ahead and undo them. This is our object without any of the materials. So we have some painted steel for the blades. We have an emissive, just for the little trimmings, give it a nice little effect. Then we have our base layer, which is kind of like a matte finish black, and then we have our shell, which is a glossy white to go on top of it. So those are our layers. However, there's actually a few things that you can do, just baking the maps. What we would do is we'd go over here to the bake textures. So I do find it best to start in 2K if your computer can handle it. If you do it at 4K, even my computer, with as good as it is, it kind of chugs along a little bit. So I like to go in 2K, and then right when I finish with everything, then I'll bump it up to 4K. And you actually don't even have to bump it up to 4K here. When you go and export it, you have the option if you wanted to. But, it's good to check it right here to see what the desired results would be. So that's a nice little feature that Substance Painter has. And another thing that we want to do, just to get a little bit of life, we did have the ambient occlusion when we were modeling, which added shadow to some areas. So we'll go ahead and we'll go to bake textures. We don't need the ID. We do want the ambient occlusion. Now for all of these maps here that we want to bake, it's going to default to 512, but since we are going to 4K, usually you don't need to have it as big, just because they are kind of like faded details. They need to be settled. You don't really want them crisp, because then you can kind of notice a lot of things, and they're normally a little bit blurred out to kind of give it a smoothness to it. So we'll go ahead and do 1K, and then pretty much everything else I just leave as is. Sometimes I might change the secondary rays, but usually when you try it right out the bat, it comes out pretty good. So let's go ahead and hit bake textures and just give it a hot minute. There we go. So as you can see, we got a little bit of shadow right in here. So let's go ahead, if we disable it, we can see it's just these tiny subtle shadows, but they make all the difference. And actually, if you look at the occlusion map, you can kind of see it here, and when we export it, you'll see it a little bit bigger. Oh, there you go. Pretty much you can see where it's adding those shadows. So a lot going on. Once again, it's very subtle, and that's why we don't need it high res, because it is kind of blurry. If it's too crisp, then it would be a little wonky. So after that, since we are using Unity, another great thing about Substance Painter is when we go to export our textures, as I said, you can go ahead and change it from here. So like I said, usually before I export it, I go ahead and just set it to the 4K so I can see. Maybe I do need to clean some things up, but most of the time I won't. I tend to put it in the images, and then I usually create a new folder. So we'll just call this drone, so that way it all goes into one. And then that makes it easier when you export it. So when you bring it into the Unity scene, you can just drag the folder in rather than the individual textures and have to create a folder then. So it just saves a step. So once again, one of the other cool things is that you have all these different configurations that you have, and they have one right here for Unity. And you have standard metallic, standard specular. Since we are using some metallic, we obviously want to go with the metallic, and it's going to give us a metallic smoothness map. Now, since I added the emissions, we go to metallic, and I've already customized one, so it'll include the ambient occlusion map, and the same thing with the emissions, so those normally aren't there. And the way you would add those in there is if you go to configuration. So this is the Unity standard metallic. So then I came in here and I went ahead and I added extra maps to them. Nothing too hard. And when you have the padding selected, what that does is basically anywhere that's near the edges of the normals, or I'm sorry, of the UVs, It adds like a little bit of a bleed in there, so that way, like, you know, because if it goes right to the line, sometimes you might get undesired results where it doesn't have, like, you know, the color you want, or it mixes the wrong color, or just nothing at all. So having the padding kind of, like, you know, fills in those blank spots of what's the nearest color, so that way, like, you know, you don't have to worry about, like, you know, going in and fixing it. It does make the maps look a little bit awkward in the end, and I'll show that after I export it here, because it kind of makes, like, you know, kind of all these hard edges everywhere, but when you load it into the scene, everything will look exactly how it does in Painter. So if we open the folder, let's go ahead, we have our maps here. Let's go ahead and make these extra large. Yeah, so as you can see with the bleed, or the padding rather, the missive stayed normal, but, like, you know, it doesn't quite stay to the shapes. It kind of like makes these big blocky kind of areas, as opposed to only just the areas that we have painted. And that's pretty much all there is to it. But, you know, it is kind of good to know some of the shortcuts and what things do, and how it optimizes everything. Thanks for joining me. Hope you learned something, and I hope to see you around.